time for our first lecture. If you haven't, though, let's take a moment and make sure that you've watched the introduction video that is on the announcements page. It has some really great information on how to navigate the course, things to look for, things to expect, etc. So make sure you watch that first. If you haven't, stop this and watch it. If you have, then welcome to our first lecture. We're going to start kind of basic in this course, and we're going to talk about early American literature and what that means, because we're going to go through literature throughout the ages, so to speak, starting with the beginnings of this country when it was claimed land until about the Jazz Age. So we're talking like the 1920s. That's a lot to cover in 16 weeks. So let's start with just some very basics. So when we're talking about early American literature, what do we mean? What does early mean? How do you define that? And also, how do you define America? Well, what we're talking about is really a span of land along the East Coast that extends from into Canada, slightly into Canada, down to somewhere around Central America. And it really stayed, as you can see on the map here, it really stayed along the East Coast. Of course, we know now it continues over to the West Coast and California, Oregon, Washington. But at the time, we didn't really venture out there. The colonists and the Puritans and everyone, pilgrims who were coming over, stuck to the East Coast. Well, that's because this was their main source of nutrition. All the ports were there, so fresh food from fresh food they were growing, and there was good farmland there, but other food and clothing and resources, medications were coming in by boat. So it was a lot easier to access these things if you stayed on the coast as opposed to trying to bring it to the coast and then farther into land. So we're talking early American, we're talking before the 13 colonies existed, into the establishment of those 13 colonies. That's early American. And if you look at those writings, you'll find it's not a lot of fiction. We don't get to fiction immediately in this country. We're more focused on staying alive. And you're going to see this. This is something that is a characteristic of literature, no matter where you are reading literature from, what country, what era, it doesn't matter. Literature is a reflection of society. It is a mirror of culture and a mirror of what is going on, because people have these experiences and then they write about it, even if it's fictional. So you will see eventually we will make a shift and start writing more about fiction, and then there'll be a shift and it'll be more about science, and then another shift going back to fantasy. So it swings back and forth like a pendulum on a grandfather clock, and it just keeps going back and forth and back and forth. It never really veers from the different genres and characteristics that have been established. So we're going to see this throughout the semester. And going back to early American, when we're talking about the colonists, we have a very extreme focus on survival. Well, that's what they were experiencing at the time. They were recording different legends and folklore they were encountering as they, explored these new lands. Also, not necessarily maps, but more like journal entries or diaries of agriculture and topography and, what things were looking like, what things felt like, the 4 seasons, depending on where in the 13 colonies you were. They also would listen to different oral traditions, which is something that was passed from generation to generation orally, stories they would tell maybe around a campfire or in fields while they were working, but they never wrote them down. So the colonists come over, they hear these stories, and they write the stories down. So now we have a written record of these stories. This is the kind of literature that we have. It's, again, not quite fiction. We're not there yet. We will get there in the course. But it's more just a record of what we are doing, of what's keeping us alive. It's a fusion as well. It's not strictly English writing, as in from people who came from England. And it's also not strictly the Native American narratives and traditions and their folklore. as of course they are already here and truly American at this point. We have a fusion of everybody. It's a melting pot in literature, which is, I think, quite apropos considering that we are, as a country, a melting pot. We have French influence, European influence from England and Spain, some German influence mixed with what was already on this continent, the Native American influence, but also some Central American and what is now Canada, some Canadian influence. And it all comes together to create a very unique identity in the writing. That's early American. Now we have different people coming over here, like Leif Erikson, like Christopher Columbus, John Smith as well later, Amerigo Vespucci, of course, after whom we are named. I never got that, by the way. If we're named America after Amerigo, but everybody's focus is on Christopher Columbus, why aren't we called the United States of Columbusville? I never quite figured that one out. But I digress. So we have different people coming over and exploring the area. When they come over, you may remember from history classes that they bring with them good and bad. They bring with them some training, education, expanding their minds and the minds of those they encounter, but then they sometimes also bring in sickness and are susceptible to sicknesses that are already here. This is also recorded in the literature. Remember, it's like journals and diaries, so they're going to have this record of what they are experiencing. The problem is, while it's good for us to have this record, sometimes it can be quite eye-opening, just like it was for the different governments who were sending these explorers over, hoping to get more control, more land, more money. They're sending these different people like John Cabot and Walter Raleigh over to what is now USA. But they are coming over, they're experiencing good and bad, writing about it, sending it back to their governments, mostly kings and queens. And the royalty, the governments are reading their descriptions and transcriptions, and they're realizing, wait a minute, yeah, there are some benefits here, but is it worth it? So all of a sudden, some of the governments slow down their support monetarily and otherwise. This is a cause of some angst. Now you have settlers and explorers, pilgrims even, who are over in this new country and are starting to feel cut off from their sources of food, clothing, medicine, education, farming tools, and they're having to try and make it work on their own. Well, this is creating, again, some dissension among those who are here, and it's starting to create some turmoil. Then, not only are we giving diseases and sicknesses to the natives who were already here, but we're starting to gain sicknesses and diseases as well. And that is causing more stress and turmoil. The Spanish come over, they start to bring people to the country, and now you have another influence on literature and on how to establish a colony and how to survive, which is good, but they bring with them their own metaphorical baggage and their own sicknesses, and is adding more stress and tension. Well, some people still were okay with that. They came over here because, some people came over here because they didn't like the country where they were living. The countries sometimes were enforcing taxes or religions on their citizens, and those people said enough, and they decided to come over to America. And they were well aware. You can try to come over on this voyage to America, but please keep in mind, it's treacherous. You might get sick on the boat, probably will get sick on the boat, and you might die on the boat before you even get to America. If you don't die, if you stay alive, you'll come to America, but you'll be really sick, and you might die in America. Chances are high you will arrive either ill or dead. And people have said, okay, sign me up. It was that important to them to get out of their countries and to get out from under whatever oppression they were suffering and risk serious illness and death to try their hand at this freedom. How bad was life that they thought, yeah, it's okay. I'm going to come over. I'll risk it. I'll risk bringing illnesses to people who are already there, my friends and family who are already there. I might bring them the flu. They still wanted to do it. It was still worth it to them. Well, this paints a very interesting picture of America. At some point down the road, and not too long, luckily, maybe around John Smith's time, things turned around and got a little better. In fact, at one point, America was the land of wealth and opportunity. But until then, or before then rather, it was still a tumultuous land with a lot of stress in its inhabitants. So this is very interesting. If you look at the East Coast, we have three distinct groups, both culturally and economically. New England is still what is today New England, a cluster of states now, but at the time colonies, in the Northeast. Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, that area. That's still New England. The southern colonies was about Virginia down to Florida and extending even beyond there into the West Indies and Central America. So the southern colonies is basically Virginia south. Everything between New England and Virginia was the middle colonies. Now, in these three colonies, they are distinct because they each had a different focus. New England, it's a little colder than the other places. A lot of people are coming in through there, Plymouth, etc., Boston. So they were more focused on surviving the winters, but they also saw the importance of education and tried, at least for a time, to focus on educating their inhabitants. Southern colonies, they weren't so concerned about winter weather and winter illnesses. They were more concerned with the heat and making sure that they survived the summers. And the crops and the farms were different. And their focus was on farming. They didn't care about education. They wanted farming to be their focus. The middle colonies were somewhere in between. You might still see hints of this in modern society. Even accents alone. New England has its own distinct accent, which is different from the Southern accent, which is different from the middle range average American accent. So you can still see distinctions in these groups, and it goes back to colonial times. The first permanent English settlement in North America was, of course, Jamestown, located here in Virginia. Why do we mention this? Well, a few reasons. One, it was the first English settlement, and it wasn't until 1607. So you have, like 100-something years, 115 years or so of people coming to America. You have Spanish coming over, Portuguese coming over. The English came over, but they didn't have a permanent settlement until 1607. So it takes that long for people to kind of figure out the land, figure out where is best to put up camp, and how to survive. And of course, the most notable, most recognizable person from Jamestown is Captain John Smith. We will talk more in depth about Smith and his writings next week. But we do have to mention him, just like we have to mention John Cabot, Christopher Columbus, because he's one of the primary figures in the establishment of not just America, but American literature. In fact, Captain John Smith stands among them, yes, but above them, in that his is some of the most notable, if not the most notable, of the early American settlers' writings. Specifically, because while he also is writing, in essence, a journal or a diary, like the others, such as Christopher Columbus, Smith's was really vivid. He used colorful language, at least colorful for that time. It might not seem so colorful to us today, but at the time, very colorful language, lots of descriptions, lots of painting images for the reader. Instead of having very cut and dry writing, readers, especially government officials, would read Smith's pieces and feel like they were seeing parts of Virginia that he was seeing felt like they were smelling the Virginia tobacco smell and the fish smell. Felt like they were hearing the roar of the ocean and the songbirds. They felt like they were there because he was able to describe it so uniquely. Because of this, not just what he described, but how he described it, he became well known and well read at the time. And since then, he's been one of the cornerstones in early American literature. Now, we know the Pilgrims are coming over. They're settling, they're starting up their own little camps and settlements, and then they could become towns, and they have farms on the outsides of these towns. There are some businesses in the towns. Because of this, they're more focused on making sure that everything is up and coming, that they are able to survive seasons that they know are a little harder to survive. They've been here long enough to know the routine. You know, snow these months, bad rain these months. So they're more focused on making sure that they can establish different communities that can sustain the weather and that they can continue to grow. Well, this means education, especially literature, is no longer the focus. They still will, keep an eye on it in New England, but by and large, it's not the main focus. They're more focused, especially the southern colonies, like I said, on making sure that their farms are good, their communities are good. The doctors are trained to help those who are falling ill. They want to make sure that they can live. The more urban colonies, again, New England, parts of middle colonies, they weren't really focused on reading either, but they made sure, again, they kept an eye on it. Their focus, though, wasn't so much on farming. It was more the religious discord that had come over. Now, here's the supreme irony here. The colonists came to America because they were trying to look for religious freedom. They were tired of being oppressed and being told what they could or could not do, what God did or did not say. They wanted to be able to worship as they wanted to worship. Well, they come over to America. Everybody who comes over for religious freedom starts to encounter everybody else. And even though they all are here, kind of like, let's let bygones be bygones, I'll worship my way, you worship yours, it turns into, oh, well, you can't live in this town unless you worship this way. You can't be my neighbor unless you do this on these days, because that's what my Bible or my Torah or my religious book, that's what it says. And it became a real source of contention. And now suddenly the urban colonies are no longer happy either. Add to this, while the printing press was a phenomenal leap forward in technology and in society, it also is considered to be the most destructive thing to come out of the Industrial Revolution. Here's why. Gunpowder and the printing press came out at the same time. Might not seem like a big deal, but it is. The printing press comes out and it starts quickly printing for cheap different pamphlets, political propaganda, even leading up to the American Revolution. We start seeing different pieces of literature that are really getting the colonists angry and fired up. They're angry at each other. They're angry at England and other European countries. And what do? Instead of taking them into counseling or having group meetings and saying, okay, calm down, we give them guns and gunpowder. Do you see where this is going? So now we have all these fired up people. They're reading different political propaganda, and they're going outside with their guns. Yeah, this cannot possibly end well. To help kind of hopefully counter this, maybe it was not foreshadowing, what's the word? Maybe it was like a premonition, so to speak. But do you know what the first book was to be printed on the printing press? And maybe this one was selected specifically because the printer saw the writing on the wall and knew what was coming. It was the Gutenberg Bible. Specifically, Gutenberg published the Bible first. That was the first thing ever to be printed on the printing press. Then came all the political propaganda. Well, he had good intentions when he published the Bible first. However, This created even more dissension, specifically between Christians, Catholics, and Protestants. They're both Christian, but Catholics and Protestants do have different versions of the Bible. When Martin Luther left the Catholic Church, he removed some of the books from the Bible, and that became the King James Version. So you have the Gutenberg Bible comes out, and Catholics and Protestants are both looking at it, and they have different things to say about it, because some are saying, well, what about this book? And others are saying, well, this interpretation of this book. Add to it that previously, kings for Protestants, kings and ministers, and priests for Catholics were the ones who were sitting down, reading the Bible with them, and helping people to interpret the Bible. Well, now that Gutenberg has published it, everybody has a copy of the Gutenberg Bible, or knows of someone who has a copy, and they can sit down for themselves and read the different biblical verses and have their own Bible studies and their own interpretations of things without a king, a minister, or a priest present. Well, this also creates stress, tension, and dissension among not just the Christians, but Christians and other religions as well. So, how does all of this come together to create early American literature? Can you see where we might be headed toward a revolution with the dissension we have with England and some of the European countries? Could you possibly also see how we already at the onset of this country have developed our own identity with New England, the southern colonies, and how literature coming from those different areas could be very, very similar in one way, but also very different in another? Everything that happens, again, like I mentioned at the beginning of lecture, everything that happens is in our literature, and if it's in our literature, it's a reflection of what happens. The events, the fears, the joys, the expectations, whatever we are experiencing as people, it is in the literature. So yes, we can see how these different events are shaping American literature at that time. Add to it the different settlers coming and encountering the American Indians who are here. The Native Americans and the Pilgrims sometimes got along and were helpful for one another, like the, Thanksgiving tradition, but not always. And Cortez, Columbus, they come over and they continue to push the boundaries of exploration in the names of the countries they're here in the names of freedom and settlement. But what is the cost? In some instances, it's mass death. Sometimes it's peace and growth. Is it worth it? Well, when we read the literature, some people say, totally worth it. And other people say, maybe not so much. Let's take another look at this. So these are all some things to keep in mind, setting a groundwork for early American literature and a starting point for this course. So for homework, what I would like for you guys to do, every week, I think it's every week, there might be one or two where you don't have to, but every week I will have a points to consider file for you. It's immediately under this lecture video. You open the template that is there for you, I provide it for you, and you'll have some questions. These are things, they are not questions where you can look up an answer. These are questions that are based on your own thoughts. I will ask you something like, if you watched a movie, okay, so little Van Kuren 101, my favorite Pixar movie ever is Finding Nemo. So let's say that I had shown you Finding Nemo, and then I might ask you a point to consider something like, who is your favorite character and why? Or what do you think is the impact of Finding Nemo on 5-year-olds? I don't know, off the top of my head. I would ask you a question like that, and you would have to tell me your thoughts. So those are the kinds of things that I'll be asking. It means when you go through the readings, you want a close and careful reading. Pick up on different nuances. If there are words you don't know, stop and look them up. If you have thoughts or questions, write them down. Keep that record so that when you have a question that I ask, you can go back and hopefully have a concrete response. Please also keep in mind I don't give a word limit or a word expectation for these because they are based on your thoughts. But I will tell you right from the get-go, if I ask a question, then you give me a 3-sentence response, that does not tell me that you have thought this through. These points to consider take the place of in-class discussion. And when we're in class, you might give me a 3-minute or a 3-sentence response, but then I can say, well, why do you think that? What led you to that conclusion? Where in the text did you get that idea? And I can prod to help you give a complete answer, but I can't prod when we're talking about an online response. So make sure that you answer fully. Ask yourself the who, what, when, where, why, how, and then answer yourself. That makes sure that you have the needed detail and the needed development so that I can read your answer and know that you really thought this through. So you have your points to consider this week. This week only, there is a syllabus quiz. It is open syllabus, so please have that file open and then answer the questions looking at that file. It is also a discussion board that is due every week. Just like your points to consider, you will have a discussion board. This week, normally it would be based on the readings. This week it's really just introductions. I'm looking to learn a little bit more about you guys and to help you guys learn a little bit more about each other as well. If you have questions about anything in the lecture, any of the homework, figuring out how Blackboard works, what have you, please don't hesitate to send me an email, and this is, of course, the same throughout the semester. Send me an email, stop by my office. I'm in the Middletown campus, or if you want to call me as well, my number is on Blackboard and on the syllabus. I'd be more than happy to help you however I can to be successful in this course.